Hey, Speedtards. Hope everyone's doing well. Before I start reading this chapter of the Bonnot Gang, I should announce that for the remainder of the series, I'll be switching to solo readings. The reason being the last two episodes, there really wasn't a lot to talk about. I think the text kind of speaks for itself. It is a good book, and I'm enjoying going through it, though. So, without further ado, I will start reading. Chapter 7 of The Bonnot Gang by Richard Perry. The Birth of Tragedy. The highest feeling of power and security finds expression in that which possesses grand style by Friedrich Nietzsche. The First Ever Holdup by Carr. The regular bank messenger for the Rue Ordinaire branch of the Societe Generale had been ill for the last 4 days, but his replacement, Monsieur Cabby, did not alter the normal routine. At 8 o'clock he went as usual to the main branch in the Rue de Provence, and picked up cash checks and correspondence for his local branch. In the company of another messenger on a similar mission to St. Ouen, he boarded a tram at the Place de Trinité for the 20-minute journey to the Championnat stop on the corner of Rue d'Amermont and Rue Ordinaire, where his bodyguard, Monsieur Pimens, would be awaiting him. Despite the cold and the continuous rain, it was still fairly busy Thursday morning in Rue Ordinaire, but not too busy for an inquisitive butcher to miss the luxury limousine parked across the street from him outside number 142, and it had been sitting there since shortly after 8 o'clock, and was still there 20 minutes later, with the curtains drawn, the motor still running, and the chauffeur in a dark gray coat, gray cap, and goggles, sitting patiently at the wheel beside another man, similarly attired, but with his dark gray cap pulled down almost over his eyes. Perhaps the curious butcher wondered why such a beautiful limousine should have so much mud clinging to the wheels and running board. Whatever the reason, Bonnot could not help but notice the man's rather over-interested gaze, and decided to move on. He slowly cruised up to number 148. In the back, Raymond, wearing a black bowler and large overcoat, was on the edge of his seat with nervous tension, next to the mysterious fourth man. They sat in silence, with only the almost noiseless patter of the drizzle as company. Octave exchanged a few words with Jules, and glanced at his watch. It wouldn't be long now. His eyes were fixed on the corner of the street, where he soon expected to see his victim appear. A few minutes later, Octave spotted the 30-year-old bodyguard walking out of the bank, and passed them toward his point of rendezvous with the bank messenger on the corner of the street. He stood there and waited. The grating of the wheels on the steel rails and the clanging of the bell heralded the approach of a tram. As it ground to a halt at the Championnat stop, a handful of bowler-hatted gents got off, but only one was given a firm handshake by the bodyguard. Monsieur Pimens turned, and they both headed down the street toward the bank. As they approached, Octave fingered his Browning automatic. It was now or never, and they had already covered 50 yards. Octave turned to Raymond and declared, "Let's go," stepping out of the car as he did so, with his cap pulled down, his shoulders hunched, and his hands thrust in his pockets. He fixed his gaze on Cabby, and marched straight towards him, with Raymond a few paces behind him to his right. 20 yards from the bank, and 6 feet from the messenger and bodyguard, Raymond and Octave whipped out their guns, and thrust them in their opponents' faces. M. Pimens covered his face with both hands and ran past them to the bank, as Octave pushed Cabby to the ground and grabbed a small satchel. Raymond seized the briefcase, but Cabby would not let go and was dragged along the street for a couple of yards. Octave shot him twice in the chest, a third shot missed, and ran to the car which Bonnot had brought alongside, and which he was already turning to the left. Octave jumped into the front seat next to Bonnot, but Raymond dropped the briefcase in the gutter, hurriedly retrieved it, threw it in the back, and then scrambled in, as Bonnot executed a screeching V-turn into the Rue des Clois. Raymond managed to slam the door while Garnier fired a few parting shots over the heads of some of the foolhardy pursuers before the car swung a sharp right, up the Rue Montcalm. Bonnot swerved to avoid a bus and a scab-driven taxi, both drivers receiving warning shots, and then turned another sharp right into the Rue Vaugrenard, where a few exhausted pursuers finally lost all sight of them. 5 minutes later they sped through the Porte de Clichy, without stopping at the customs barrier, and then headed northeast towards Saint Denis. At the time, wrote Octave, we didn't really know where we were heading for. Eventually we took the road to Havre, but not directly. We made several detours. After racing through Pontoise, some time after 11 o'clock, they stopped in order to check on the extent of their haul. They were counting on getting 150,000 francs in cash. Octave ripped open the small satchel and pulled out just 5,500 in bills. He divided the sum quickly between the four of them. Then Raymond opened the larger case, only to find it stuffed full of checks and bonds, to the value of 130,000 francs. For a while they were rather despondent, but they perked up a little when one of them suggested that they could sell the bonds, or as Octave pointed out, they could simply try again. They did not know that the bank messenger, cabby, had been carrying a wallet attached to the inside of his jacket, containing 20,000 francs in cash. Garnier took the wheel, and the gang set off through the driving rain for Beauvoir. Raymond began sorting through all the bonds, putting to one side any checks made out to a named person. He flung the empty wallet out of the window. Garnier soon got lost around Gessor, increasing the general sense of irritation. Doubtless, Bonnot was wishing that they'd done the burglary. Daylight robbery wasn't exactly his forte, and it hadn't even paid well. The dark gray sky glowering overhead reflected their mood as they made for Beauvoir to stop for petrol. On the outskirts, a custom official signaled them to stop, but Garnier just pressed his foot hard down on the accelerator. We abandoned the common courtesies. He was even stupid enough to try to run after us. Then he just stood and stared in amazement. Doubtless, the ignoble brute had never seen anything like this before. A quick stop was made to purchase some bread and chocolate, before they set off for Rouen. Bonnot driving. Just outside the town they hailed once more, this time to get some oil. They were also lost again. The four of them stood in the street arguing about which direction to take, and what to do with the car. Raymond was for dumping it in the Seine, but it was evidently agreed to dump it over a cliff near Le Havre. By this time it was dusk, and in the darkness Garnier lost his way again, and they ended up in Dieppe, sometime just before 7 o'clock. As it was almost out of petrol, they agreed to abandon the car in a deserted street. Octave chose the Rue Victor Hugo, and drove unwittingly onto the beach. The motor conked out and the luxury limousine spluttered to a halt. It was only when Octave stepped out of the car and sank up to his knees that he realized they were stuck in the mud. They succeeded in tearing off the false number plates, 668X8, and chucked one towards the sea, and the other into the casino garden behind them. Bonnot stopped Garnier from setting fire to the car as it might attract some unwelcome attention. As they hurried to the railway station, a stiff sea breeze whipped off Octave's hat and sent it spinning in the direction of the cold winter sea. It wasn't his lucky day. By 1 in the morning, all four of them were safely in Paris, having arrived on one of those somnolent boat trains carrying a sprinkling of drowsy passengers from England. Hopefully, the police would think that the gang had taken the night boat to Southampton, at Gare Saint-Lazare. Raymond eagerly bought a copy of the right-wing La Patrie, which sported the following headlines: The audacity of Parisian brigands. A bank messenger attacked in Rue Ordinaire. Bold attack in broad daylight. Their crime took precedence over that of a banker who'd embezzled no less than 1 million francs, 200 times as much as the illegalists had got away with. The robbery had already been reenacted for film, and the very next day was being shown as part of a musically accompanied newsreel at local cinemas throughout Paris. That day, the Société Générale offered a substantial reward for the bandits' capture, as did New Scotland Yard. It was assumed that the gang had indeed fled to England aboard the night boat Alma, which sailed at 1 o'clock. La Presse reported the robbery as without precedent in the history of crime, and called them les bandits en auto, the motor car bandits, for as yet it was unknown for criminals to use cars in such a manner. The press slated the police for allowing such a thing to happen, especially as it was discovered that of the 84 cops cited in the Quartier, There were, at any one time, only 18 effectives, of whom only one was on the beat. The right-wing Gaulois declared that the police had to cope with no less than 200,000 bandits in Paris, out of a population of 3 million, and were therefore obviously under strength at 20,000. The London Times, however, suggested a different reason as to why the police might be losing the war against crime. The press notes with increasing concern that at the moment when thieves and other pests of society are daily resorting to more daring methods, the police are being more and more diverted from their primary duties in order to mount guard over strikebreakers and others who in normal circumstances ought not to require special protection. In this sense, the class struggle was their ally, just as they were a part of the class struggle despite their individualist consciousness. Garnier, Bonnot, and Raymond Le Science had already made the cry of their revolt be heard. The only worrying thing about the press reports was a sentence tucked away at the end of the column in a couple of Parisian dailies. The police think they may be a connection with the anarchist Mandino killed at Châtelet-en-Brie. Crime doesn't pay. As they had so much in the way of bonds and negotiable checks, Bonnot suggested that they try and sell them in Amsterdam, the best place for such transactions, because the law there tended towards leniency, laxity even for fences. Bonnot knew of a contact there through Rodriguez, named Vanderberg, who might be willing to buy. Raymond went off to find Jean Debeau to act as interpreter, while Bonnot went to meet Belloni to arrange for his things to be picked up from Rue Nolette. He certainly didn't intend to go back there himself. Octave went to see Marie, promising to meet them later. It seems that on the Friday night they stole a car and immediately set off for Amsterdam. Arriving late on Saturday, 23rd of December, Vanderberg, however, had bad news for them. The bonds might be of great nominal worth, but at the moment they were the hottest property in Europe, and their serial numbers would already have been telegraphed everywhere. It would be better to wait a few months, and then try cashing them outside Europe, in South America perhaps. Until such suitable time, the bonds would remain in his safekeeping. He would get in touch in 2 months. Neither could he suggest a buyer for the car, so they dumped it in a canal and caught a train back to Paris, arriving at the Gare du Nord on Christmas Eve. Raymond expressed a desire to visit Victor and headed off to Belleville accompanied by Octave, while the others went their separate ways. Sometime after 9 o'clock, Raymond knocked lightly on the door of 24 Rue Fessart, and was let in by a somewhat surprised Rirette. They took off their bowler hats and seated themselves near the fire. They both looked worn out. Octave was sullen and laconic, and Raymond seemed awkward. Raymond confirmed what Victor and Rirette had guessed, but dared not voice, that they were the authors of the Rue Ordinaire robbery. Victor pointed out that they'd taken a risk turning up there, as the premises of Lanarkey were habitually under surveillance, something which did not alleviate Octave's sense of unease. Rirette asked them to talk softly as the children were asleep, and offered them some warm milk, which they both humbly accepted. At midnight the church bells rang out, heralding the start of Christmas Day, and coincidentally Octave's birthday. He was just 22. As Raymond made a sort of last confession to Victor, his childhood friend, a mass of God-fearing Catholics confessed to the priest and ate the flesh and blood of Christ. In the dimly lit room, the conversation died. The atmosphere was strained, and as the local church clock struck 1, Octave finally announced that they must be going. Victor felt a chill as he looked into those penetrating black eyes. Those eyes which Cabby would never forget, and which, along with the large mustache, were the most salient features of the description of his attacker. Garnier was someone who would never feel any remorse for what he had done, or any hesitation in doing what he felt needed to be done. He was so different from the almost baby-faced Raymond, who was too cynical really to believe in what he was doing, yet who had thrown in his lot with Garnier's revolt. They buttoned up their large black overcoats, put on their bowlers, shook hands with Victor for the last time, and slipped out into the cold night air. Meanwhile, the hunt was on to find where the Delaunay Belleville had been kept in the week prior to the robbery. The neighbors opposite Detweiler's place had been suspicious of the nocturnal comings and goings for some time now. and having read about the robbery, determined to report their suspicions to the authorities. The beadle at the local town hall received them cordially, and promised to inform the appropriate people. In fact, thinking that he might be able to make a fast franc out of it, the beadie telephoned a journalist at the Petit Parisien, a popular daily. The result was that 3 days after Christmas, the Petit Parisien informed its readers that the car used in the Rue Ordinaire outrage had been kept in the garage of an Alsatian mechanic in Bobigny. The police were, not unnaturally, furious, and although at 6 o'clock the next morning the chief of the Surete, Hammond, and a score of detectives raided the place, Edward Carroy had flown. George and his wife were taken into custody, as was Edward's lover, Jean, when she turned up to her misfortune at 6 that evening. The detectives could find no material clues, however, and so they concentrated their efforts on the 3 captives. Finally, it was revealed that the second man was Carroy, already known to the police as Leblanc, alias Pettigris, alias Aiguille, and wanted by the Belgian authorities. Both he and Detwiller were known anarchists. It was obviously time to turn to Xavier Gouchard's intelligence for information on such people. In the meantime, a warrant was put out for his arrest, and his photo released to the press. He was named as the author of the robbery. The police suspected that the gang might be in Amsterdam. As soon as Edward had realized that a journalist had been sniffing around and asking awkward questions about the car, he cleared out and went to stay with his partner in crime, Marius Medge. He was living at the time with Barbie Lachey in a small bungalow called Hollyoake, in the western suburb of Garches. Edward was extremely aggrieved that he'd been named as the principal author of the Rue Ordinaire job, especially as he'd specifically decided not to get involved with Bonnot and Garnier. Dubois had been wise enough not to let them keep the car in his garage. More's the pity, and he, Edward, had proceeded with Detwiller to allow them to hide the motor at his place, although, of course, at the time he'd no idea what he'd used it for. He was annoyed to think of the grilling that Jean would be getting at the hands of those bastards at the Surete. Still, they couldn't pin anything on her. As he shaved off his beard and thought about dyeing his hair black, he saw the face of the most wanted man in the country reflected in the mirror before him. It was time to show the comrades that there were easier ways of stealing a few thousand francs. On January 2nd, he and Marius made their way across the southern suburbs of Taille near Choisy-le-Roi. It was an ideal job. A wealthy 91-year-old rentier, Louis Hippolyte Moreau, had lived off his unearned income for the past 35 years in a large, old, detached house, which few people came near. His only companion was the 72-year-old housekeeper, who'd been in his service for 22 years. It was a cold, foggy night as they walked up to the house in their espadrilles. They clambered onto a zinc-covered shed and dropped noiselessly into the garden, leaving their footprints in the snow. In no time at all they were inside the house, searching for the old man's renowned fortune. Exactly what happened next we shall never know, but it seems that the housekeeper and the old man were disturbed. The intruders stabbed the rentier and clubbed him with a hammer. The old woman was silently strangled. Which one of the pair, or perhaps it was both of them, committed these dreadful deeds is unknown. Victor Kobalchich later wrote that the Medge, alias Cookie, paid for another's crime. But given that by then Carroy was dead, he could just have been doing Medge a favor. Neither of them admitted their guilt. They left the premises at 4 in the morning with 5,000 francs in gold, Louis and an equivalent amount in bonds. Medge also took an umbrella and some earrings as gifts for Barbie. A week later, on January 10th, Carroy grew suspicious that they were being watched, and they all cleared out to no one knows where. On January 12th, Xavier Gouchard took over as head of the Surete, following the announcement on New Year's Day that Hamard was to be made head of intelligence. It was thought that Hamard would clear up to Rue Ordinaire affairs first, but when he failed, it was left in the hands of his deputy, Louis Jouan, who was busy keeping Rimbaud's place in Pavillon-sous-Bois under surveillance. Jouan himself had hopes for promotion, but his working-class origins, the fact that he'd only been an NCO in the army and lived unmarried with his common-law wife, all told against him. He could hardly match the impeccable bourgeois credentials of the authoritarian Xavier Gouchard, an ex-Marine officer who'd served in New Caledonia, son of the eminent appeal judge, and whose brother just happened to be head of the Parisian municipal police. As head of the 3rd Brigade, Gouchard was already well hated by the anarchists. His methods tended to be provocation and harassment. The 12,500 franc reward having enticed nobody, and his informers having signally failed to provide any useful information, he decided, much against the advice of Luen, now officially vice chief, to begin a series of raids on the addresses of known anarchists and their meeting places. Gouchard ordered his subordinates to restrict all reporting to the press. The searches began in the working-class communes of Bobigny, Pantin, and Aubervilliers, then moved out to Pavillon and Lagny, and back to Bobigny, in the hunt of Courroy. These trawling operations revealed little, despite threats and minor charges being slapped on some comrades to encourage them to talk. In one raid, on a dance in Belleville, no less than 29 of the 50 people present were found to be illegally carrying firearms and were so charged. At rather a loose end, Gouchard accepted Juan's advice to release Jean Bellardi in the hope that Courroy would attempt to contact her. Courroy did not fall for the bait. On Friday 19th January, detectives arrested Louis Rimbaud and found him in possession of firearms from an armory burgled the previous November. There have been 2 significant arms burglaries since then, one in the early hours of Christmas Eve at Fourroy's, 70 Rue Lafayette, and the other on the night of January 9th at the Smith & Wesson Armorers, 54 Boulevard Haussmann. From the latter were stolen 17 revolvers, 6 hunting rifles, 2 Parker cannons, 2 Harrington revolvers, and most worryingly for the police, 9 Winchester repeating rifles. For most anarchists, carrying a revolver was simply a matter of image. They were rarely ever fired in anger, except at each other. But given the reckless nature of the bandits they were currently pursuing, it would be a matter of extreme anxiety if such lethal weapons were to fall into their hands. While Monsieur Gilbert, the investigating magistrate, questioned Rimbaud, Gouchard took a Saturday morning off to attend the invitation-only execution of Renard, the worker from La Villette, who had shot and killed a policeman in August 1910. Bourgeois justice was done in the cold light of dawn, and the body taken to Ivry for burial in an unmarked grave. 2 days later, the police raided the premises of Lydie Lebrun, in passage to Clichy, and found Marie Vollemin there. Intensive questioning revealed that she'd been living with a certain Octave Garnier in Vincennes. But a search of 42 Rue de Laitière turned up very little besides a few burglars' tools. However, when the photos were shown to cabbies still in hospital, he almost had a seizure. It's him, he cried, admitting he'd made an error in identifying Courroy. The photograph was released to the press. The police confidently announced that his arrest was now only a matter of hours. Jeux sans frontières. Octave Garnier had left the Rue de Laitière with Marie on New Year's Eve, after hearing of Detweiler's arrest. They spent a few days at his brother's place in Rue de Plateau, while Octave arranged for René Vallée to rent a safe house somewhere. Posing as a corrector proofreader for L'Illustration, he rented a small 6th-floor garret in, of all places, Rue Ordinaire. On January 8th, René and Anna moved in, bringing with them a bed, a table, and a couple of chairs. Octave slept sometimes at Godorowski's in Rue Courtot, but now more often at René Vallée's. Marie went to stay for a while with Lorelot at Lydie Lebrun. Louis Dieudonné had abandoned Lorelot around Christmas, after several heart-rending meetings with her husband, Eugene, in the cafes of Montmartre. Eugene had arrived in Paris from Nancy just before Christmas and arranged through David Bonnot to take Bonnot's old room in Rue Nolette. Bonnot told the widow that Monsieur Comtesse was away on extended business in the Côte d'Azur, and introduced her to Monsieur and Madame Aubertin, who moved in on the 26th or 27th. Bonnot, meanwhile, had contacted Rodriguez, now back from his custodial sojourn in England, with a view to disposing of the stolen bonds. He arrived on the 18th, the day before Rimbaud's arrest, and checked into a hotel near Barbès Rochechouart in the name of Alphonse Lecoq. Bonnot was staying in Sotteville on the outskirts of Rouen. The illegalist comrades now decided to increase their range of operations to Belgium, in places that Garnier and Calaman knew well, or had knowledge of second-hand, through Courdoy and Dubois. On the day after Marie's arrest, Bonnot, Garnier, and Calaman took a train to Ghent, and that night broke into the garage of a local doctor. Bonnot drove the stolen Laudelet Deluxe to Amsterdam, where they sold it for 8,000 francs. On the way back to Paris, they stopped off in a town in the Nord and successfully burgled the house of an aged rentier. However, bad news awaited them on their return. Octave discovered that Marie was in custody, and that his photograph had been splashed all over the main Parisian dailies. It was too late to turn back now, even if he wanted to. Only Raymond was as yet not suspected of any involvement in the Rue Ordinaire holdup, although it could only be a matter of time before his name cropped up. That day, January 26, Marius Medge, Barbie Ladèche, and Arthur Mallet were arrested in St. Cloud and taken to police headquarters for questioning. Both the men were found with loaded revolvers in their possession. Following this, Bonnot and Garnier dashed down to Lyon to see the Tholins' lawyer to find out if there was any possibility that Judith might be bailed. Unfortunately, the lawyer explained, Judith was in a rather worse position than Jean or Marie, for instance, because she was charged with receiving stolen goods, and was unlikely to be bailed, given her association with one of the most wanted men in France. On the other hand, they might release her from custody in order to try and trap him. More than that, he could not stay. The two men caught the train back to Paris, and after meeting with Calaman, set off again for Ghent. On the town's outskirts, they found a promising garage with 2 cars inside. While Bonnot was trying, unsuccessfully, to get the cars to start, the chauffeur turned up by chance. He refused to start one of the cars when ordered to do so by Bonnot, either through obstinacy or his lack of understanding of French. Angrily, Garnier picked up a log and brought it crashing down on the chauffeur's head, killing him with one blow. As they ran off, they were challenged by a night watchman, who was gunned down by Garnier for his pains, although he lived to tell the tale. Seeking a quick means of escape, they tried another garage, but they were disturbed there also, and were forced to walk a few kilometers to the station at Wetteren to await the first train. In Antwerp, they met up with Jean Dubois, and the 4 of them set off for Amsterdam, to see if there was as yet any possibility of negotiating the Rue Ordinaire bonds. Again, the result was negative. Still in Holland, they managed to steal a car, even if it did break down halfway across Belgium, forcing them to return to Paris by train. When they got into the Gare du Nord, they found the press carrying reports that the police were looking for a gang of 5, based around the northeastern outskirts of the capital, who made their living from burglary, car theft, and forgery. Beside the report were 3 photos, those of Bonnot, Garnier, and Courroy. It was said that they plotted their coups in cafes on the Boulevard Clichy. The anarchist link was now firmly established. Victor's dilemma. After Raymond and Octave had left Rue Fessart in the early hours of Christmas Day, Victor felt that he had to do something to show Raymond, at least, that he was not abandoning him. There may have been no love lost between Victor and Octave, and Bonnot was unknown to him, but Raymond was his oldest friend. Victor had never engaged in criminal acts in the past, and would not do so now. But he had always vigorously defended the actions of revolutionaries when confronted by the repression of the state, or the reactionary hysteria of public opinion. As a propagandist, as de facto editor of L'Anarchie, it was his duty to support his erstwhile comrades, in print at least. The first edition of L'Anarchie for the new year appeared on Thursday, January 4th, 1912, and contained an article entitled The Bandits, signed by Le Retif. To shoot in full daylight, a miserable bank clerk proved that some men have at least understood the virtues of audacity. I am not afraid to own up to it. I am with the bandits. I find their role a fine one. I see the men in them. Besides them, I see only fools and non-entities. Whatever may result, I like those who struggle. Perhaps it will make you die younger, or force you to experience the manhunt and the penal colony. Perhaps you will end up beneath the foul kiss of the guillotine. That may be. I like those who accept the risk of a great struggle. It is manly. Besides, one's destiny, whether as victor or vanquished, isn't it preferable to sullen resignation and the slow, interminable agony of the proletarian, who will die in retirement, a fool who has gained nothing out of life? The bandit, he gambles. He has therefore a few chances of winning. And that is enough. The bandits show strength. The bandits show audacity. The bandits show their firm desire to live. Only 2 sentences detracted slightly from this laudatory article. Their acts are the effects of causes situated over and above their personalities, causes which will only disappear with the discussion of the social order, dissolution of the social order, In other words, banditry existed only as a response to, in this case, capitalist society. The article implied that the Bonnot gang were merely the agents by which this recurring phenomenon was now being carried out. The individuals involved were not masters of their actions. They were simply playing out roles. Or perhaps he just meant that despite the vigor of their actions, they remained ultimately constrained by circumstances of time and space, not of their own choosing. A truism. Victor developed his arguments in notes made for 2 causeries to be held over the weekend on 27th and 28th of January. The first talk, The Individual Against Society, was to be held at the Université Populaire in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The second, entitled The Bandits, and billed with the Matinée Artistique, was guaranteed to draw a good crowd to another Université Populaire in the Rue de Tretaine in Montmartre on the Sunday. Kovalchich argued that society was the enemy of all individuality, through its laws of social conservation and conformity, which deformed individuals into stunted, although socialized beings, who could do little more than conform to a role. He was under no illusions about social progress, and fatalistically suggested that things would always be pretty much the same. As he repeated in a reply to a letter critical of his article, he considered the actions of the bandits logical, inevitable, even necessary. Victor felt that he had justified rather than eulogized the bandits, although among us they are the only ones who dare to assert their right to life. He wrote a second article called Anarchists and Criminals, which appeared in the next issue of L'Anarchie, in which he emphasized that this: outlaws, marginals, bandits, they alone dare, like us, to proclaim their will to live at any price. Certainly they live far from us, far from our dreams and our desires, but he had as much sympathy for them as he had for honest folks who've either made it or missed the boat. The police, of course, were convinced that the bandits were not at all far, either physically or ideologically, from L'Anarchie. This milieu had been under almost constant surveillance. Le Retif himself was first noted by the Anarchist Brigade in July 1910, while Gauchard was still in charge. They even had a letter from the Brussels Gendarmerie, dated 12 September 1911, which listed 15 anarchists known to frequent France, amongst which were 1. Courroy Edward, dangerous, always carries a Browning pistol. 2. Dubois, Jean, with his mistress Bartholomew, Ida. 3. Lecotte, Henry Charles. 4. Calaman, Francois Raymond. And 9th down the list, Kovalchich Victor. It was noted that they all frequented 16 Rue Bagnolet in Romainville, the home of L'Anarchie. Other names cropped up on the back page of the paper itself, in a column headed 3 Words to Our Friends. Besides Rarette, Lorelot, and Le Retif, there were messages for Courroy, Dubois, and Calaman, a.k.a. Raymond G., Platane of Lyon, Dioudon, Ruska, Rodriguez, Belloni, Mallet, and others as yet not introduced into the story: Simontov, Elie Monnier, Sazy, Reinhardt, Barai, Bill, Ducret, and Victor Grongo. In other words, it seemed that L'Anarchie was the link between the group from Lyon and the group from Brussels. They were all a part of the same political milieu, of which Victor Kovalchich was the most outspoken theorist. Police informers and plainclothes detectives kept a constant watch on the meetings of the Causier Populaire, and one reported that the people of the Rue Fossard seem happy with the rapid increase in banditism. Of the illegalists, it was said that one lot became illegal through following through their theories. The others covered their deeds with theory. And it was added that many causiers populaires old-timers since the days of Libertad had left this milieu completely, finding them too compromising. Durupt and Israel were given as examples. At last, Gauchard ordered a raid on Rue Fossard for Wednesday, January 31st, a day when many comrades would be there getting the paper ready for distribution. Young Chinette heard the knock on the door at 6 in the morning and ran down the stairs to open it. In walked Louis Jouen and dozens of detectives. Victor later recollected that Jouen spoke to him amiably of the ideas of Sebastien Faure, whom he admired, of the deplorable way in which the outlaws were discrediting a great ideal. He seemed neither malicious nor hypocritical, only a deeply distressed man doing his job conscientiously. All the 11 people taken in for questioning were released without charge. But Victor was not to be let off the hook so easily. The following Tuesday at 7 in the morning, Rue Fossard was raided again by armed detectives, who took away a handful of letters, some postage stamps, and rather more seriously 2 Browning automatic pistols. That afternoon, Victor was arrested and taken to the headquarters of the Surete, where he and Rouret were charged jointly with handling stolen goods, namely the 2 pistols, which both originated from the Rue Lafayette armory burgled that Christmas Eve, 1911. It was Rouret who later admitted that she had, somewhat thoughtlessly, bought them from a comrade for herself and Victor. Kovalchich was now in a rather invidious position. Rimbaud, Medj, and Mallet, known associates of Carroy, had all been found in possession of the same type of gun, albeit from different burglaries, and the bullets fired in the Rue Ordinaire holdup also emanated from a 9mm Browning. It was quite conceivable that the guns found at Rue Fossard could link Victor directly to the auto bandits. Jouen talked amiably but frankly to Victor about these matters. Maybe things would be easier for him if he helped the police with their enquiries. After all, they both knew he knew exactly who the bandits were. Perhaps Victor could supply them with some valuable information. Victor, however, remained silent. Jouen continued to talk again about how the bandits were discrediting the anarchist ideal. He could understand how one ought to remain loyal to one's friends, but those articles he'd written didn't look good in the fight of the charges against him. They might even be used against him as evidence of a conspiracy. Victor, clearly irritated by such a suggestion, repeated that he'd had nothing to do with the Rue Ordinaire robbery, and knew nothing of the whereabouts of any of the people involved. The vice-chief of the Surete tried a different track. Marius Medj was in custody, charged with having burgled the Romainville post office the previous autumn. Carroy was also suspected. Stamps from the post office had been found at the Rue Fossard that morning. The obvious explanation was that stamps had been bought when Lanard was still at 16 Rue de Bagnolet, and they'd simply been taken with everything else during the move back to Paris. But Carroy and Medj regularly stayed at Rue Bagnolet, and perhaps still visited Victor and Rouret at Rue Fossard. Did Victor by any chance know of the whereabouts of these 2 men on the night of January 2nd? He had no idea. Jouen informed him that Medj was being charged with the bloody murder of the old man and his housekeeper. Victor refused to believe that either of them could have had anything to do with such an appalling crime, but was told that the police had incontrovertible proof. His fingerprints were found inside the house. Jouen pressed home his advantage. Yes, it was an appalling crime, even by anarchist standards. Could such men be still considered anarchists? Was it fair that such men should besmirch the anarchist ideal? Could he not see that by fully cooperating with their enquiries, Victor would not only be helping himself, he would be doing the anarchist movement as a whole a great favor? And to show him that he was a man of honor and had faith with Victor would see reason, he would order Rouret to be released on bail. As he was taken down to the cells, Victor dwelt upon his dilemma. It was impossible for him, as an anarchist, to say anything to the police. It was impossible for him, as Raymond's friend, to say something that might lead Raymond to the guillotine. Yet to be associated with such things as the bludgeoning to death of an old man, and the gunning down of an albeit miserable bank clerk, and all in the name of anarchy, was very hard to swallow, and Mirette was liable to arrest at any moment if he did not speak. Still, he knew what his duty was, and that was to remain silent.